AI agents, what are we expecting next?
How do we put planning and reasoning alongside this large representation of the worlds we have now?
Are we going to have products that truly never incorporate generative AI?
I think never is such a strong word.
And what's the most exciting thing happening in hardware today?
It's nice to see that finally we built big computers again.
I'm Bryan Casey, and welcome to this week's episode of Mixture of Experts. We let Tim go on vacation this week, so you're stuck with me. And I'm joined by a distinguished panel of experts across product and research and engineering. Volkmar Uhlig, who is the VP of AI Infrastructure, Chris Hay, who is the CTO of Customer Transformation, and Skyler Speakman, Senior Research Scientist. There's been a lot of discussion in the market around reasoning and agents over the last, 6 months or so. And so the question to the panel is, do we think we're going to get more progress in building reasoning capabilities through scaling compute? And this is just over the next year or so. Scaling compute, algorithmic progress, or from good old-fashioned software engineering? So Volkmar, over to you.
Very clear algorithmic progress.
Chris.
Software engineering.
All right, and Skyler.
Algorithmic. That's the next step.
All right, I like it. We got some different opinions on this, and this actually leads us into our first segment that we're going to be covering today, which is a company called Multion released a new paper around Agent Q. And this paper is demonstrating improvements in reasoning and planning. And the scenario they defined in the paper, which was using an agent to actually book restaurant reservations, was using LLMs combined with other techniques like search, self-critique, reinforcement learning. And they demonstrated some order of magnitude improvements in just the success rates of LLMs. And so maybe Skyler, as a way of just kicking us off, I'd love to hear a little bit about just why do LLMs struggle so much today with reasoning, and why is some of the work going on in this space exploring other ways so important to making progress?
So LLMs have this amazing ability to build a world model. I think I've seen that phrase popping up more and more. Sometimes it will get criticized and say, oh, all they're doing is predicting the next word. But in order to predict the next word as well as they do, they actually do have this, I'm not going to say understanding might be too long of a stretch, but they have this model of the world. Up until these new recent advancements, they had no real reason, motivation, agency, whatever you want to call it, to really go out and explore that world. But they had created that model of the world, and they could answer questions about it. So I think this idea of LLMs being limited to creating the model of the world, they did a very good job of that. I think some of these next steps now are, all right, now that we've got a representation of the world, which is pretty good at the next token prediction problem, how do we actually execute actions or make decisions based on that representation? And so I think that's kind of this next step we're seeing. Not just from Agent Q, but lots of research labs here are really trying to figure out how do we put planning and reasoning alongside this large representation of the worlds we have now. So I think these guys are off to a good start. One of the first ones to kind of put something out there, the paper down, out available for people to read. Lots of other companies are working on it as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say they're ahead of the pack.
Yeah, maybe Chris, I know we were talking a little bit about this, which is how indicative do you think some of the work that the team did here is of just where everybody's going in this space? Is this paper just another piece of data in what is a continuation of everybody sort of exploring the same sort of problems? And do we think this is pretty dialed in on kind of where the problem space is going to be around agents over the next year or so?
I think it is actually pretty dialed in. So when I read the paper, it's kind of similar to some of the stuff that we're doing with agents ourselves. So that's always kind of goodness there. But if you really look at what's going on there, is they're not really using the LLM for the hard bits, right? They're using a Monte Carlo tree search, right, to actually work out. So one of the major things that they're doing is they're using a web browser as a tool. So if they're trying to book a restaurant, for example, then what they're actually doing is doing a Monte Carlo tree search, and they're navigating using that tool to different spaces. They're using the LLM to self-reflect. They're using the LLM to create a plan in the first place of how they're going to book that restaurant. But they are relying on outside tools. They're relying on outside pieces like the tree search to be able to work out where they're going. And the fact is, that is because LLMs are not great at that, right? So it's like, it's more of a kind of hybrid architecture in that sense. And everybody's doing the same thing with agents as well, right? You're bringing in tools, you're bringing in outside memory, you're bringing in things like graph searches, for example. So GraphRag's becoming really popular in these spaces. Everybody's sort of bringing in planning and reasoning as well. I think they're doing some really interesting stuff there with the self-reflection and the fine-tuning, so that it's more of a kind of virtuous circle in there within the paper. So I think they're probably further ahead than a lot of people in those spaces. But even if you look at the open source tools, the open source agent frameworks, we started with things like LangChain, but now you'll see things like LangGraph is becoming really popular. And then you're moving into other multi-agent collaborations such as Crew AI. So everybody's on a slightly different slant on where they are in this journey, but they're definitely on the right track, I would say, at this point in time. And by the way, back to my earlier argument, that is software engineering, my friend. That is not doing anything different with the LLM. It is engineering and putting stacks and frameworks around your toolset.
To that point, Bryan, I do want to hear Volkmar's take on why algorithmic was his pick. So you have to hold us to our answers, and he's going to go next.
So my background is I built self-driving cars for 7 years, and this was always this decision between how much software engineering can we do, and how much can we train into a model. And then in many cases, what Chris just said is, it's oftentimes a packaging of different technologies together. And I think where we are right now is we have, as you mentioned, this really powerful tool, which is LLM. So we have some basic form of world understanding, and we have the world model. And now we are trying to make something do stuff which we haven't seen. It's not, just predict the next thing you do on open table, right? And so now you're in an unknown open world where you need to explore different choices. And then I think what the next step will be, you run this brute force, and then once you have those choices, you actually will train a model. That's my expectation, because that's the path I've been on with driving. So we always came up with some heuristic, huge data corpus, tried something out, and then in the end it was always like, oh yeah, now that we figured out what the underlying problem is, let's train a model to make this more efficient in execution. And so in the end, the model is just an approximation of an extensive search, right? And so I think that's why algorithmically I believe that the algorithms we will build are effectively those, graph searches, tree searches, etc., which ultimately then will feed into a simpler representation, which is easier and in real time to compute.
I was kind of disappointed by the paper, if I'm honest, and I'll tell you why. And Bryan's dreading what I'm about to say now, but I'll tell you why I was disappointed, because the whole example was the open table example. Now, unless I am wrong, and I don't think I am, isn't Multion the company that claimed that they were the agents behind the Strawberry Man, the I Rule the World MO Twitter account? So, that would have been the agent example I would have wanted to see in the paper.
It is. That was actually a question I was thinking a lot about, because they talk about reinforcement learning as part of that. And like, one of the interesting things that I've just seen in the market the last, few months or so, is there's this like light backlash happening to LLMs within the ML community, even a little bit, particularly I think the people who have worked a lot in reinforcement learning, and you even heard, folks like people talking about LLMs being a detour on the path to AGI. And I'm seeing as we've slowed down a little bit in terms of progress, I've seen the folks who operate in those kind of reinforcement learning spaces, starting to pop their heads up more and being like, hey, it's back. The only way we're going to make progress around here is some of these other techniques. And, I'm curious, maybe two questions is, maybe I'll start with this one, is do y'all think if we fast forward to a world where like agents are a much more significant part of just like the software that we're all using every day, do we think LLMs are like the most important part of that? Or Chris, to your point around this paper, that the extensive use of lots of other techniques, do we think like a bunch of other techniques are going to come and like rise back to prominence as we actually try to like make these things do stuff? So yeah, maybe I'll stop there and just see if like anybody has a take on that.
Yeah, I definitely think RL is going to come back into this. I know they were using RL in that paper, and they were also using things like DPO and stuff, but I think it's going to come back into this. So I keep thinking back to AlphaGo and the DeepMind team and, winning at Go there. And again, they were using similar techniques, as you could see in that paper there. But if you take a deep learning algorithm today on your machine and you get it to play the simple game of Snake or play the Atari games like DeepMind did, very, very simple architectures like CNN, DNN type things absolutely rock that game. If you get an LLM to play, and it doesn't matter whether it's an agent or not, that is the worst playing of Snake I've ever seen from frontier models, right? And GPT-4o is terrible at it. Claude is terrible at it. They're all terrible playing at these games. But really simple RL, deep learning, CNN style architectures actually rocket those games. And therefore, I think that as we try and solve and try and generalize, I think some of those techniques that were really successful in the past have to come back into the future. And I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of people are going at the moment. So we're going to see software engineering, we're going to see improvements in architecture, we're going to see improvements in algorithms. It's going to stack. And hopefully all of these techniques will come together into a hybrid architecture. But when you take LLMs and put them into an old sort of gaming style environment, they absolutely fail today.
Do we think there will be like general purpose agentic systems like over the next, short term, let's say like next couple of years, or is everything going to be task specific? Because like one of the nice things, Chris, like to the point about this thing being an open table, like Go book of reservation, it's a very easily definable objective, right? And that means that you can pull in a bunch of these other techniques in a ways that are harder to make kind of like fully generalizable. And so it's like when we look at agents, do we think we're going to make a lot of progress on kind of generalizable agents over the next year or two, or is everything going to be just in this task specific land? Skyler, maybe it looks like you got some thoughts on that.
No, I don't think we'll have general within 2 years. I think there will be some areas, and this might even lead to our next topic, areas around language creativity. I think that will surpass some humans' abilities. But the world works on much more boring, mundane business processes. And I think there's still a lot more ground to make on that to get those systems to a level of trust that people will use. It's one thing to have these methods, create a funny picture, write a funny story, but to have LLMs execute financial transactions on your behalf, different ballgame. And we're not going to be there within 2 years. I'll be proven wrong. You can timestamp this. That's okay. But yeah.
No, we're always accountable for our predictions on this show. So,
So Bryan, I think where we may go is we will probably get, now we are going through examples, open table, and we try another 20. I think we will get into a tooling phase where, you can actually explore a domain and with some human intervention and some human guidance, you will have tools which can explore, let's say, a web page, how to interact with it. And then you may go through some pruning process, which may be manual. But I think we will get to more automation that it will be, 10 times or 100 times faster to build this. But I think, as Chris said, there will be a software engineering component to it, which, until we are fully autonomous, you just point at something and say, learn, that will take a while. And then the question is, where does the information come from? Is it through trial and error, or we could even just read the source code of the web page, right? I mean, we have source code and protocol business processes. I can just give you, here's my billion lines of code of SAP adoption.
For the second story, there was the CEO of this company, Procreate. They are a company that builds and designs illustration tools. And I think it was on Sunday night, their CEO came out and released a video in which he said that they are never, that one, he actually said he hates Gen AI. I think he actually used the word hates to describe it. And he said that they were never going to include Gen AI capabilities inside of their product. And like the reaction from their community and the design community broadly was like super excited and supportive of this statement. Like I think as time of recording, that video's got like almost 10 million views on Twitter. And I have like a bunch of different reactions to that hopefully we can, pick apart here a little bit. But one of the things that was like most striking to me is that the way two different sets of like creator communities have reacted to the arrival of LLMs. Like I have friends and colleagues who are software engineers, and like LLMs for code, people are generally pretty enthusiastic about that. Look at it as a great productivity tool. They get more work done than they were ever able to do before. I also have friends and colleagues who are writers, who work in Hollywood, who are creatives, and who like look at the arrival of some of this technology like the Grim Reaper, basically. And so it's just like wildly different responses from these two communities. And I'm just curious, like maybe Chris, throw it over to you to, maybe get some initial thoughts and reactions to it. Is like, you have any sense of like why these communities are responding so differently to this technology?
I think never is such a strong
That was going to be one of
I'm
my
not
other
sure
reactions to it. It's like, man, never so far, really? No feature at all.
Like,
But yeah.
Yeah, I'm never ever gonna stream video content because I believe physical is more important. Well, you know what? You're out of business, Blockbusters. So I don't know. I think there is a general wave. I applaud them, right? I think they make tools for their particular audience, and their audience doesn't want that. And I think that's going to be a unique differentiator. I'm not sure how that stands the test of time. I think never is such a strong word there. The industry is moving fast, and different audiences have different needs, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that if I use Procreate, there's no chance ever I'm going to produce anything that is of any artistic quality, and that is because I have no artistic talent.
But so you're not the target audience for that.
I am not the target audience, but I am grateful for AI-generated art because it allows me to produce something that I would never be able to produce otherwise. So things like PowerPoint slides, etc. So if they are focused on the creative professionals, and creative professionals don't always want to have AI, Gen AI within that, and I understand that. That's great. You've got your audience, you've got your target, and that's fine. But I think there will always be an audience for that. But I think that tide of time will push against them there, and I think that's really going to be a very strong artisan statement to make.
Before we move on, Chris, what sort of PowerPoint art are you doing? Like that was my.
I mean, generally, if I'm honest, it's almost always of unicorns with rainbow-colored hair. That is my pretty standard
CEO
picture.
Presentations.
Yeah,
all right.
Every CEO loves a picture of a rainbow-colored unicorn.
I'm sure all the other ones do. Resonates with me. But Skyler, Volkmar, I'm curious if either of you have takes on just like the community's really reaction to like these two different sets of tools.
So I think we are in a world where, we have artists and craftsmanship, and we are going through a phase of automation of this artistry and craftsmanship. And so the bar will be really, really high, and there will be always unique art. We still today, I can buy photography, I can buy, a copy of a Monet, some of the greatest artists in the world, and can hang it on my wall. But there is still a need and a demand by people to have unique art, which is theirs. And I think that will stay. And we've seen this across, the progression of time, horses used to be forms of transportation, and now they are a hobby, right? And so, old cars is going the same way, and hopefully at some point that's with airplanes. And I think these unique pieces of art if I can automate the creation and I can, industrialize it, the industrialization wins. It always wins. But it doesn't mean that those tools and those artists and that craftsmanship shouldn't be supported. It will just shrink dramatically because, the capabilities become more accessible to everybody. If you used to have typists, now everybody can type. All the typists are gone, right? And it will be the same thing.
One of the things I thought was interesting is that you made this point about craft. Like, I think a lot of people choose their life's work because they like the craft of that, right? They chose to be an artist or a developer because they like doing that work. And so having a tool come in and like do all of it for it is like robbing, some degree of value from, the things that they do day in and day out. And one of the things that I was also thinking about, and I'm just curious if within your teams, within your own like set body of work you're doing with clients that y'all are working at, do you also see like one of the other places where I was thinking about tension around this sort of dynamic is in the relationship between management and practitioners, where like one of my observations is that like management is oftentimes particularly enthusiastic about adopting these tools because of the productivity benefits. Like I can get more things done. I can reduce my cost. I can, drive more revenue, whatever it might be. And, because those are the things that like they're running their entire organization to like deliver those results. And in some cases they've become, as they've gotten more senior, maybe one step removed from actually doing the craft. So the loss of the craft maybe feels like less of a consequence to management sometimes, but to practitioners, it's like, this is my thing. And this tool is coming around and just like doing it for me in some cases. So I'm curious if y'all have also observed any sort of like, when it comes to adoption of some of this stuff, any tension between like management and practitioners in terms of like their level of enthusiasm for this technology.
I'm not sure about tension of management and practitioners. There might be I've witnessed of which flavor or which version. So they're going to say, no, we're going to use this one, and back actually behind the scenes, somebody's using a different tool, and some tension back and forth on that one. So it's not necessarily the adoption, but maybe the channel or the tool has had a bit of that one or this one, and so yeah, that would be what I've observed.
I think it's also the question, when you look at craftsmen, there's 20% of work you love and 80% of work you hate. Oftentimes, it's like the majority. Ask a data scientist, like 80% is data cleaning. Do you think they like data cleaning? No, right? So I think the tools, like, if they support the toiling, the useless work, and make people more productive, then you shift more into the work which you actually like and appreciate. So I think there is from the engineering. I'm mostly talking software engineers here. From the engineering perspective, I think it's actually an improvement. Nobody likes Jira ticket reviews and writing comments and all that stuff. If that can be automated away, then that's an improvement in the life of people. Or I don't need to go to Stack Overflow and try to find that algorithm. I can just ask the model to write it and I'm done. And so I'm more at the architectural level. And I think from a management perspective, they want to get productivity out, but they also productivity in an engineering process in many cases is that you need to convince all the people to do these pieces of work because they're necessary for the product, but everybody hates them. So I think to a certain extent, it's an improvement on both sides.
That's a great point. I always, it's probably not safe for podcast description of it, but I always like to tell, we share those things amongst the team. So everyone should just mentally come to terms with some percentage of your job is the work that none of us want to do in this team, but we're at least going to spread it around the group a little bit. But that description, like actually, so I like a lot of the teams that I work with operate a lot on just like IBM.com, do a lot of things around content. And like the .com property has tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of pages as part of it. And we're trying to do way more with like automation and like how we connect content together and stuff like that. And it turns out in order to do that, like all your tagging has to be like really good across the entire property, across tens of thousands of pages. And it's like, oh my God, the amount of time that we are going to spend cleaning up the metadata on like this chunk of the website, it's like, just just kill your calendar for 3 days for like some whole chunk of the organization to go through this stuff. And if we can instead like build just like a really good classifier and ways of doing that, it's like that type of stuff actually lands like a huge relief and like lets us focus on doing the work that we actually signed up to do. So like at least within my team is like that's a lot of what we're doing is we're looking at this type of tedious work that is really it's important and it has to get done, to your point, but like nobody really wants to spend their day doing that. Can we do as much of that so we can actually like focus on doing the work we want to do? But like when it comes to using LLMs for like the core thing that we're doing, everybody's still a little skittish, honestly, at least in some of these. Now it's not on the software engineering side of our teams, but on like some of like the more creator side of it. So it's like some of these announcements like kind of resonate with me because I see it with some of the folks that I work with a lot.
I think one of the other things is I don't think it's just tedious stuff. I think for kind of prototyping type stuff, and ideating, it's really good. Like, so, and I don't think it matters whether you're producing content or you're producing code or you're producing images. Sometimes you're like, I have an idea. Is this going to work? It's going to take me quite a lot of time to sort of build that out. Let's just get the LLM to do something or the image generator to go do this a little bit. I get an idea what it looks like, and then I'm going to start pruning it, and then I'm going to start building the idea out a little bit more. And I personally, again, more from a software development side of things, that's kind of how I work. So at the moment, I'm sort of trying to create a distributed parameter service for training LLMs. There is no chance that I would be able to just sit and code that straight up myself, right? I need an LLM to help me out, figure this out a little bit, and then I will engineer through where I need to be with that, right? And I think that is true. And it's the same with image generation, right? It's like, if you're doing a concept and you need that unicorn with rainbow colored hair, get the
board presentation,
the image model.
Exactly.
Get it out there, and then you go, okay, that doesn't quite work in this context. I need this, and then you can go and draw your pretty unicorn at that point, right? But I think prototyping is a really important use case.
Right. And I think, Chris, like when you're doing that prototyping, right, it's like you can have a dialogue with a machine, and you get major refactorings done in seconds, right? Because you can just like, I want this other thing. Let me split this into 4 classes, or let me collapse them. The amount of work you would have to do, and that's all the tedious stuff, refactoring of code, and we have IDEs to do that, but they kind of suck. So if you can actually get an LLM to do that, it's just amazing. And like the time savings, so you can do it in an hour and, somewhere on a plane, and you can actually write massive amounts of code and experiment with it.
Brian, before we leave this topic, I think we just need to remind ourselves that you asked kind of an art question to 3 nerds. I'm safe in saying that, right? I mean, just put a disclaimer here. I think it would be a fascinating conversation to have artist representation on this question. So all of this just taken, we're talking about inevitability and tools and all of that. And I think that's where our brains go. But really fascinating to have this conversation with the artists, with the craftsmen.
It's a very point. Like one of the reasons why is because I do have, like I said, I do have like friends who do both of these things. And I have just like observed how different the reaction is from them and from like the communities that they operate. And like there's a bunch of like interesting economic factors here that play into like this. Like I think there's less concern in some cases about like more like real industry disruption happening with like the software engineering community than there is on the creative side. So it's like I think there is that just like a little bit of that kind of core underlying economic anxiety that is not quite the same in those two places, even though, you're really just dealing with like just different types of models that are helping improve productivity in different types of domains. But it'll end up landing, I think, pretty differently potentially. So I think it's a great point. We did not totally represent that other side of that of this, but it's just a super interesting topic, I think. And I think one of the things will be interesting is just to the point about never. I feel like there's so many tools that like you use them as part of a workflow and you don't even know what the underlying technology is. It's like, if you want to take a background out of an image, like, do I know that's Gen AI or something else or what, like, do I even care in some cases? So, in some of those places, I'm like, man, never really. But I think it will be interesting to see like how this space evolves over the next couple of years. earlier this week, AMD announced the acquisition of ZT Systems. And so I think, as everybody knows, like, the hardware space has been like one of the biggest winners, if not the biggest winner, so far, in terms of like the early days, at least, of like the Gen AI and LLM sort of cycle. And AMD is a company, like, obviously we've talked, and everybody's talked a ton about NVIDIA, but like AMD is obviously making big play in this space as well. Their CEO, Lisa Su, was on CNBC earlier this week, and she was talking about the acquisition. And one of the things is that, like, AMD historically has invested a lot in silicon. They've invested a lot and even doing more on the software side of it. And that the way that they talked about this acquisition is that they were starting to bring together a stronger set of capability from like a systems perspective. And so maybe Volkmar, as just like a way of kicking things off, like, why is it so important? Like, why is this market moving from just like silicon to systems? And like, why are systems and like these almost like vertically integrated systems within this space, like almost like so uniquely important?
So if you look at AMD and their AMD offerings, AMD acquired ATI, a decade or 2 decades back, and that's the heritage of their AI accelerators. And they are kind of head-to-head with NVIDIA over the years, and they own some spaces, and NVIDIA owns some spaces. I think what NVIDIA did very well over the last couple of years is to look not only at the GPU itself, but looking at many GPUs in a box, and then when you go into training, you go multi-box. So you need many machines. And the integration, if you look at the acquisitions NVIDIA did, is they acquired a company which is providing the software stack to run very large-scale clusters, which is their base command product. And then they also acquired Mellanox, which is the leader in like reliable network communication. And so AMD is sitting there, and it's like, okay, so what do we do? And they don't have a consolidated story how they can put a 10,000 GPU training system on the floor. So they're kind of locked in the box, and they are not yet at the scale where they could actually compete on the training side. And that's, I think, also the reason why NVIDIA, owns like 96% of the market. When you're trying to train, you can pretty much only use NVIDIA. And then you already did all the coding on NVIDIA systems, and all the operators are implemented for CUDA and performance optimized, because otherwise you didn't train the model. Then running it's kind of trivial, right? And so switching an ecosystem is really hard. NVIDIA went down this route of having like the DGX system, so they built full servers with all the network communication, et cetera. And AMD, I think, is just now catching up. So they're catching up on the network against Mellanox. They announced Ultra Ethernet, and now they are catching up, how to get these big systems at scale into the industry, and they need to get into the cloud providers. And so I think ZT Systems, being a boutique shop which makes very large scale infrastructure deployments happen, is a logical conclusion.
That makes one of the I think you mentioned training a lot. Like, one maybe as like a follow-up question to that. One of the observations I have just about like the GPU market in particular is that it feels like more vertically integrated than the world of CPUs does, at least like somewhat. And is like, one, I guess, would you agree with that sort of characterization? And two, if you do, like, is building out the sort of unique set of requirements maybe around the training stack, like, is that like the underlying core force around why this market is like behaving the way it is and why it's behaving differently? Or do you kind of see that story like differently than the way I just kind of laid it out?
I think the training system market is a traditionally very esoteric market, which is the high performance computing market. And at IBM we built like top 500, like number 1 and number 2 top 500 supercomputers with Blue Gene, LPQ, and the follow-on systems. And suddenly we are in a world where that is not anymore a domain of the labs, which drop $100 million and get a computer. Suddenly every company which wants to train a network at scale needs similar technology. And so what we are seeing is, after 20 years or 40 years almost, like HPC being a very esoteric field of, let's say 50 supercomputers in the world, suddenly it's it's a commodity, and your startup with two.
We should all have a supercomputer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, I need a supercomputer. You don't have one? So, and
I got an unfinished basement,
Exactly. The joke on Twitter was like, I'm GPU poor, right? So I only have like 100. So and if you want to play in that market, you need to actually offer a solution. And I think AMD has been traditionally in the desktop market with the GPU, or like enterprise market with the GPU, and they sell servers, but they never build these systems. NVIDIA, being an actual GPU vendor, amazingly has captured like 85% of the dollars spent in the data center. Right, so it's like, yeah, your Intel chip, good luck, and a little bit of memory, and everything else we take. We take the switches, and we take the Ethernet cards, and we take the GPU, and that's the other 85%. And so for AMD to get something deployed at scale, I think they need to have an offering which is on par. I think Intel with Gaudi is in a little bit better shape because they have partnerships over 50 years with Dell and Lenovo, et cetera. For them, it will be easier to get into that market because they already have an ecosystem, and that's not the case for AMD.
This is why I don't get it, Volkmar. I actually don't get the acquisition, because if, like, let's say I was an Apple company, not Apple, but an Apple company, and my market, everybody bought Red Delicious apples because they're great apples, but my company sold Granny Smiths and nobody ate Granny Smith apples. Why would I buy a company that makes better packing boxes for my apples? That's my problem with it. I'm kind of like, if I'm spending $5 billion, spend the $5 billion on getting better GPUs, right? And go compete with NVIDIA. That's where I don't quite understand it in my mind.
I think the NVIDIA figured out a way of actually delivering it, deploying it to partners. And to a certain extent, AMD got locked out in that space. So they need to find a way to market. And in particular, that way to market, if you look in the training space, a huge percentage of the training is actually happening with the hyperscalers. Companies, like, they want to put NVIDIA cards on their premises, but in many cases, in particular for early beginnings, they go into the cloud. And ZT is delivering to the hyperscalers. So for them, it's a way to get into the hyperscalers with a solution where they say, okay, we give you the whole thing. So you take down the risk on the hyperscalers.
I'm not sure people do want to use NVIDIA. I think, I think that NVIDIA's got this market locked, and NVIDIA's awesome. They make great GPUs, but at the same time, Apple seems to be doing well on the desktop market or the laptop market with their chips and with MLX as a framework. So, custom Apple silicon seems to be working out well. You're seeing companies like Google invested in their own kind of ASIC-based chips with TPUs. You see other people move into ASICs as well. I think there is a space for a low-cost alternative to NVIDIA chips. And I think there is a market for that, because otherwise other companies, hyperscalers, et cetera, wouldn't be investing in that. And that's why I'm saying I don't get it. NVIDIA by far makes the best GPUs across the board. They're an incredible company. I just think if I was a competitor, I would try and find a niche in that space which isn't the packing boxes.
Yeah, I think the really in the training market right now, NVIDIA is just the only choice you have. And I think this is primarily where AMD is trying to break in. I think in the inference market, there will be, like you said, Apple and, there's Qualcomm, there's a ton of chip vendors, and there's a plethora of startups in Silicon Valley who are trying to make like super low power, et cetera. But in the training market, if you look where AMD is going and the wattages they are putting down, where it even goes above 1,000 watts on a GPU in the next generations, that is where NVIDIA is effectively the only game in town, and I think they want to put something up against it. And you only have
for pre-train maybe, but not necessarily fine-tune.
Fine-tuning, I think you can, in many cases, you can do in a box. Like, you do not need a huge system, yes, but in the pre-training market, you do. And this is where right now you buy NVIDIA or you buy NVIDIA. And Gaudi isn't there yet, AMD isn't there yet, and so I think this is effectively an attempt. And who knows let's see how it plays out, right? I mean, thank God I didn't have to make the decision, but I think this is an attempt of breaking into that large-scale training market and delivering, very, very large HPC systems. Companies run 100,000 GPU training clusters. Building that takes, a year. It's massive investment. It's in billions of dollars. And so if you want to capture some of those revenues, then you need to have, it's not, like, oh, we collect like 3 engineers and they put up a supercomputer. It's like, no, this is a construction process, right? And this is where AMD with this acquisition finally has a chance of bringing the guys with the hard hats in as well, because you need to put power in and cooling and all this stuff, right? And I think they don't right now, because that's all rendered out. They do not have the experience, and so I think they're buying the competence.
But that point about competence was actually something I saw come out a lot in the discussion post the acquisition, where this is a company that does have a lot of capability around doing exactly that, building out large-scale clusters, some of the biggest in the world, essentially. And it's a kind of an interesting theme that I've heard at every level of the whole Gen AI stack at different points over the last year or so. You hear it in the hardware side, you hear it, and it's really like to the point about being like, oh, you're almost rate limited by the amount of expertise that's in the market right now. It's like in the hardware side, I heard it. On like the training side, you heard it for a while. On even like the prompt engineering side, like, people refer to them as like, magic encampments for a little while. And there was like this, like only a certain like group of people even really knew how to prompt the model correctly. And a little bit of what I've observed over the course of like the last, I guess like almost 2 years at this point, is that like as this thing has blown up, like it feels like some of those skill shortages are like getting less acute. Like more people know how to train models. More people are getting competent working with models. More people obviously are like attracted to the hardware side of the equation because of some of what's happened over the last couple of years. I'm curious, like across the board, like how much do you feel like our progress in AI is still rate limited by just like raw expertise across the world in this space, and like how much has that improved or not over the course of the last like year or two? And so maybe Skyler, just kick it over to you, start.
I have this conversation pretty regularly with our director, and I would say it's not necessarily the overall amount of skills. I think that definitely is monotonically increasing, but how it's distributed across the globe, that's becoming more extreme. And so I think that's something that we are experiencing. We're IBM Research Africa. We represent 1 billion people, but the talent that here is probably going to emigrate. And what does it look like to have that talent here and bring that culture here? So yes, it is increasing, but I think at very different rates across the globe. That'd probably be my short summary of that. And it is something that we do talk about on a regular basis, is what does capacity in generative AI look like on a really global scale? So that's probably another session entirely in itself.
I was not expecting that. That was a fascinating perspective on that. So yeah, Chris, Volkmar, thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, I think there is such a gold rush, and it's a new technology, and so it's a lot about even trying it out, and every day there's something new. So you need people who are really passionate about it, and that they spend their living and half sleeping hours on it, and so the skill set I think will develop over time. I feel like we are repeating the gold rush of the web era, where I was like, oh my God, you can write a web service, isn't that amazing? And now it's like, yeah, everybody can do it. And so I think we are just in this uptick with a very like extreme supply shortage, and because it's so deep, like when we just plugged the computer into a network, it was relatively easy. I mean, it's like, okay, here's a computer on a network, go. Now it's like the training is different. Do you need to even understand what math is? And most engineers hate math. That's why they like computers. And so there's this set of skills which need to be built up. And until it actually rolls to the universities and we get people who are truly practitioners. So first you need to get the education, and then you need to become a practitioner, and you need to toy around with it for 5 years. So I think for the next 10 years, we will probably be in this, plus the speed of change, we will be in this world of, there's supply shortage everywhere. I think on the flip side, coming from the systems corner, it's nice to see that finally we built big computers again. So I really like this. And that we are actually going away from, like, the cloud providers do everything for us, and we need to actually look at system design with a fresh angle. I think that's a goodness for the industry. So it was kind of locked in, and the only there are like 5 companies in the world who still know how to plug a computer into a network and to a power socket. And I think it's good that we are actually going through more of a renaissance of computer architecture and design. At least from my side.
Yeah, I'm the total opposite. I think that people are. I think people are learning the skills, and they're doing a great job of that across the globe. But at the end of the day, if you want to train a large language model, you need an awful lot of GPUs, and you need access to an awful lot of data. And that is outside of the access to the average human being. So there is a lot of really great skill talent, and they are not going to be able to practice their craft because access to the GPUs to be able to learn what is the effect of this data just isn't there. Now you can learn from doing things like fine tuning and training very, very, very small models, etc. But at the end of the day, we know that for the larger models, it emerges on the higher scale, and therefore. And at the scale now, it's tens of thousands of GPUs to be able to do that. And I think that is what's locking out the average practitioner. So me personally, I want to see more distributed compute. I want to see more access to GPUs and skills. And therefore, I think, to kind of Skyler's point, I think that will open up a really talented set of people that are distributed across the globe to be able to make great contributions in that area. But at the moment, it's going to be concentrated in the big tech companies because they're the ones with the GPUs.
Chris, I want to fight back on your fighting back. That's why we do this, right? If I have a researcher that comes to me and says the only way they can make their case is that they need 10,000 GPUs, that's not a good argument. That researcher needs to be able to make their case off of 2 GPUs. So
I agree.
Where's that conversation start about making the case off of this 2 GPU example? Show that, then we can talk about the 100, the 2,000, the 100,001. I don't think it's fair to say I can't make progress unless I have 10,000.
I agree, Skyler, but again, we're sitting in a company who has 10,000s of GPUs, right? So they can go to you, make the argument with 2 GPUs, and then you can give them access to scale, right? But the average person, they might get so far with 2 GPUs, and then they're like, I don't have the money now. Well, I'm going to go and do something else.
So we're moving to a world of universal basic compute. It sounds like. I feel like that's been a little bit memey recently. So we will call it a day there. Volkmar, Chris, Skyler, thank you all for joining. Great discussion today. And for those of you out who are listening to the show, you can grab Mixture of Experts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. So until next week, thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time.